2D platforming? Check. 16-bit retro-style pixel art? Check. A unique 8-way grappling hook? Well, it's more of a zipline and not exactly 8-way, but who's counting? No aimless wandering, straight-line corridors, or designed by algorithm and just handcrafted stage-based action? That last part I actually read from the official website. Welcome everyone to Aces High Gamers, and the game in question is Steel Assault, a 16-bit retro-style action platformer published by Attribution Games and is the first game to be developed by the international team based out of New York City, Zenobia Interactive. In Steel Assault, you run, jump, slide, zipline, and electric whip your way through a futuristic post-apocalyptic landscape to take down a famous inventor and roboticist turned army general. Enter Taro Takahashi, daybreak resistance soldier out for revenge against the sovereignty that killed his parents and is taking over what is left of the world after a late 2030s thorium bomb was detonated during the Second Pacific War. The bomb dispersed radiation that did not cause any visible damage, but rendered the area uninhabitable while still preserving the natural resources at the detonation sites. In early 2046, a man to claim these wastelands was Magnus Pierce and his army of robots who started collecting the resources and occupying what's left of these once great cities. Equipped with a zipline, a boost pack of sorts, and his 8-way electric whip, Taro sets out for his quest for vengeance. Per an interview with the game's creator on where consumer tech comes first, Steel Assault was originally a Kickstarter project from back in 2015 and set to be a late NES 8-bit style game, taking influence from other games such as Bionic Commando, Castlevania, Mega Man, specifically Mega Man Zero, and Contra Hard Corps, with some references to The Last of Us, as well as the films I Am Legend and Children of Men. As the team grew, the idea to transition over to a 16-bit style was agreed upon, albeit some initial backlash from the campaign backers. The game was delayed in November 2020 with the announcement of Tribute taking over on the publishing part of the game. To quote the interview, to assure a most optimal game design and launch, they have evaluated that it was better to change the release window. The game will be available for you to play in 2021. It is currently being polished to assure a gaming experience that is worth the wait. Now, after a short demo was released in February of this year, we fast forward to the release date of the game, which was just last week on September 28th, PC through Steam, and also the Nintendo Switch. So, how does the debut title for Zenobia hold up? Let's dive into the details. Also, very big thank you to Tribute Games for the review copy of the game. Leading things off, we'll start with gameplay and controls. The gameplay for Steel Assault is pretty much what you would imagine from a side-scrolling arcade game from the influences mentioned earlier. Controls are your standard 3-button fare that can also be remapped, thankfully, as default controls felt a little off to me. But once set, it felt very responsive and simple enough to play. You've got an 8-way electric whip that's used not only to dispatch enemies, but also to cancel out any kind of flashing projectiles. Most enemies are taken out in 1 to 2 hits, with the bosses obviously taking more. It cannot be used while running. You're forced to stay still during its animation. However, you can use it while you're jumping forward. Pickups consist of health replenishment, a shield that will take 2 hits, and an electric projectile upgrade for the whip, which shoots 3 electrical bolts in a cone shape and also doubles the damage output for the whip itself. For traversal, you've got a double jump as well as a short slide that grants a brief period of invulnerability, which is really useful when there's a lot of gunfire on the screen, as well as certain stage hazards. The game's main highlight is a zipline that allows you to attach to platforms, buildings, and terrains of various heights, and you're able to move freely up, down, side to side, and up and across, and also able to attack while you're hanging from the wire. 4 difficulties to choose from to fit your skill levels, although most players should be comfortable with normal. However, if you're familiar with these types of platforming games, Expert presents a good amount of talent challenge without being too crazy. Expert also adds changes to the boss fights. For example, the Stage 2 mini-boss has a flame attack that will hit whatever platform you happen to be standing on. Now, in Expert, actually, if you're standing in the middle, the boss will actually fire his flames in the middle in between the 2 platforms. So you have to make sure you time your jumps correctly, and if you don't, you're actually going to get hit and knocked down. It adds just a little bit of a different flow to the battles to help it stand out enough. Up next is audio-visual. Starting with the music, this game has an excellent soundtrack. The use of effects with some guitar riffs added in give the game still a retro-style sound while having the ability to still sound modern. Each song fits the stage, the environment, and the boss fight pretty damn good. Very well done start to finish. There's even an option to turn on the FM Arrange soundtrack to give the game a little bit more of an old-school vibe as it removes the modern sound elements. You've also got sliders that can adjust the sound and the music a couple of notches in each direction for balance. As for sound, everything was created by the studio in-house. A few placeholder sounds did happen to sneak into the release but were recently patched. Everything sounds unique and distinct enough to keep up with the retro style that the game is going for. Now, as for visuals, they're done pretty well here. From the burning of woods and buildings, to the overgrown skyscrapers of Manhattan with their animated TV screens in the background, to even the fluid effects in some of the levels that are actually hazardous if you happen to jump in. The devs even went as far as to give the water some reflection. Little details like this were a nice little touch. Taro, your standard enemies, and Magnus's second boss phase fight didn't have the same level of detail as some of the others, but the majority of the bosses, considering their size, very well detailed and animated smoothly. Speaking of animation, I do want to look back to Magnus's second phase, as he seems to have a few extra frames of animation here, and it looks really smooth, very well done. In the options, you're greeted with a few things here. You can add borders to the sides of the game as you'll unlock new art by completing, various difficulties, as opposed to having the two black borders on the sides, considering that the game runs in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Again, very old school retro style there. You've got a frame limiter and VSync options as well. Now, for my laptop, I was actually forced to use both, as without them, the game was very unstable. It was either very choppy or it would run around 1000 FPS, no joke there. It made the game look like it was on hyper fast forward. Once I turned them both on, I was capped off at 60 frames per second, and it stayed pretty consistent, never really dropping under 55 for any given period of time. Next up, we're going to go over enjoyment and displeasure, basically pros and cons, kind of in a summary type of way. You've got easy to use and customizable controls, fun gameplay. You've got a lot of variety between the levels and the enemies, so nothing seems to be too stale or too boring or too repetitive. Great 16-bit retro art, both in terms of the stages and the character designs, and a really rocking soundtrack that you can even listen to outside the game. Now, for displeasure, I would have liked to get a little bit more mileage out of the zipline, as I feel it was not utilized enough. Maybe a couple of more power-ups would have been nice, and even the ability to use the whip while you're running. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. The length of the game is not super long by any stretch. Now, I've been seeing these complaints so far this past week since the game came out, and I have to agree, but only to a point. The game is a retro-style action arcade platformer. Games like this are never super long. We now know the game is only 5 chapters long, but to quote the interview from earlier, the game is roughly the length of an average arcade side-scroller from the 90s, perhaps a bit longer. It is comparable in length, if not quite in beauty, to a game like one of the 16-bit Contras, or perhaps Metal Slug. Now, I did do a long play of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, a few months back on the channel, and it took me, start to finish, to the end credits, 55 minutes. My first playthrough for Steel Assault on normal, as learning the game and such, it actually took me over an hour. So there you go. Second time playing through it, however, on normal, it actually only took me 35 minutes. So again, I understand. This is a good segue into replayability, which is a direct factor into value. The game has 4 difficulties, which again, most will play on normal. Expert adds an added challenge by taking away checkpoints and free health replenishment at the scene transitions, cuts down on the number of item boxes, and adds a few more enemy spawns while also making the boss fights a little bit more dynamic as well as more difficult. It also has an arcade mode, which is essentially expert, but it has no continues at all. One death forces you to start back from the beginning of Chapter 1, so it requires a 1 credit clear. If you're looking for a challenge, Expert and Arcade will give you that, which adds to the replayability of the game and whether or not you're getting enough game for your buck. There are not many unlockables. It's just game art, which fills in the black bars on the sides of the screen while you play, which is something you can do with or do without. Now, with that said, I'd like to measure value not in a numerical score or a percentage, but something a little bit more simplistic. I'd like to call it now, later, or never. Now, even though value is subjective, at $15, this game sits between now and later. It is definitely a game I would recommend for you to pick up, whether it's right now because you either love retro art and the retro soundtrack and old school gameplay from games like back in the 90s, or later after DLC is released, if it does happen to, it hasn't been confirmed, or if a discount comes up. That's up to you. I personally would recommend getting it now, especially if you're a fan of these style games, as well as supporting a new developer in the indie world. That's going to do it for this review of Steel Assault. Let me know what you think of the format of the review in the comments below, if it's good or if there's room for improvement, and what your thoughts are on the game itself if you've played it, or if this review happened to help you make a decision whether or not to buy it. Take care, everyone, and thank you all for watching.